Thank you for joining us in Heritage Events Live. We're delighted to welcome you to our policy polls on the expansion of the opium trade in Afghanistan. Please welcome our speakers, Lawrence Baumeister, former Supervisory Special Agent for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, and Paul Larkin, Jr., Rumpel Senior Legal Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. We hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come and spend this portion of it with us. What we hope to do today is educate you about the facts regarding a very important issue. Whatever the so-called axis of evil might have been years ago, today it is the combination of international terror networks, transnational organized crime syndicates, and state-approved or privately created and operated large-scale narco-trafficking enterprises. There often is a close nexus among those three groups because of the huge profits that drug trafficking produces. The result is that the same evil people often wear three different but related hats. Consider the danger that this problem presents us. In her book, Seeds of Terror, Gretchen Peters wrote that it cost Osama bin Laden only $500,000 to carry out the 9/11 attacks. At the time her book was published in 2009, however, Al-Qaeda was making more than $500,000 per week from narcotics trafficking. The upshot is that terrorists then and now can financially afford to make us suffer a 9/11 type loss every 7 days or less. What effect will the fall of Afghanistan have on drug trafficking and terror? Will our withdrawal make narco-terrorism more likely? Will Afghanistan become a narco state? To answer those questions and decide how to respond to the answers, we need to know the facts. Not the facts as described for us by Washington, D.C. politicians, but the facts known by the people on the ground in dangerous lands. We start that education today. We have an expert to tell us the facts based on his experience in dealing with Afghani narcotics trafficking. He is retired DEA Supervisory Special Agent Larry Baumeister. Larry, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Paul. So we have a relatively short period of time to cover a lot of information. So what I'm going to do in the time that I have initially before our question and answer is kind of talk about a brief history of how we got to where we are today, to talk about any expansion of opium and heroin trade. We have to kind of know what we're expanding from. So in three parts, I'm going to try and bring us back to where we are now. The first part is going to be about the Taliban and the drug trade prior to 9/11. The second part, which is probably the largest part, is the same, the Taliban and drug trafficking that went from 9/11 up until just recently when the US and the coalition forces left Afghanistan. And then finally, and this part is going to be something we'll be talking about, I'm sure, afterwards, is what's going to happen post, US leaving Afghanistan. So getting to the first part. So DEA has been in the region, if not in Afghanistan, for decades. And prior to 9/11, we were working out of our embassies in Pakistan and in Turkey, maintaining a relationship with those in Afghanistan, knowing who were the players prior to 9/11, who were the narco terrorists, who were the Taliban that were supporting them. There was a myth that went around a lot of people within the government that the Taliban was not involved in drug trafficking prior to 9/11. There's a little bit of truth to it, but it really goes to show the complexity of it. So prior to 9/11, some of the top Afghan drug traffickers, the kingpins the DEA was aware of, made a deal with the Taliban where the Taliban was going to reduce opium production, but they made a deal with these top level drug traffickers to allow them to amass a stockpile of opium so that once the Taliban reduced production, they would basically corner the market and the Taliban would gain profits from that. So they made a deal, and then they decided to reduce the opium production. So there was a plan from the beginning for the Taliban to make money and profit from the drug trafficking. So bringing us around to where post 9/11, everything changed. And so you can kind of see on the map here. So when U.S. and coalition forces came into Afghanistan, they did control a large portion of the country, but there were always swaths of land that were under Taliban control. And what we're going to be talking about here mostly is along the eastern and the southern parts of Afghanistan. If you look, the three main provinces from east to west along the border with Pakistan, you've got Kandahar, Helmand, and Nimroz province, which we always refer to as the tri-border area with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. And there's a little dimple at the bottom of Helmand province, which is the town of Baram Shah, which was always like no man's land. It's where the drug traffickers and the Taliban all merged together, and it was a protected area. A lot of the drug labs were set up there under the protection of the Taliban. So even when we were at our biggest surge of troops in Afghanistan, there were always these swaths of land that were under Taliban control. And so when we were targeting these people over the years, it was always in Taliban controlled areas because that's where the main traffickers were located. So during this time also, DEA increased its presence in Afghanistan. We had a big office in Kabul, and we had in Kandahar and in Jalalabad and other places. But what we were doing, in the country, in Afghanistan, is working with the Afghan National Police, helping training the prosecutors to do drug cases, to do major drug cases. They set up a judicial wiretap, which really helped target and prosecute internally within Afghanistan those traffickers that were able to be arrested in Afghanistan. So all of that was extremely helpful. And those judicial wiretaps not just helped in drug cases, they also helped counter threat. They captured a lot of information. As you can imagine, drug traffickers are dealing with a lot of other nefarious characters, and so they picked up information that was for the benefit of not just DEA, but for other U.S. and Afghan entities. So that was a big deal there. At another point during this time, there was a major change in transportation. If you could change slides, please. So what was happening historically is Afghan heroin would go through Iran, protected by Iranian intelligence, going to Turkey and then through Europe, or up through the northern route through the stands into Russia. But what started to happen during this time, around 2009, we noticed it even more, was they would bring it down through Pakistan. Pakistani ISI intelligence service would help with the transportation and protect it down to the coast of Pakistan and Iran, the Makran coast. And there, maritime transporters started moving mass quantities of Afghan heroin down into East Africa, mostly Tanzania and Mozambique. And so at this time, the largest stockpile of Afghan heroin outside of Afghanistan was in East Africa. And from there, it was shotgunned all over the world, including to the Western Hemisphere. So something else that happened here that was extremely important, around 2006, the US passed a new law, the 960A law, which is referred to as the narco-terrorism law, which was a game changer for DEA and the US. This allowed US law enforcement entities to charge foreign drug traffickers with providing material support to terrorist organizations. So the thing that was different with this law, as opposed to any other importation laws is we did not have to prove that the drugs were going to the United States, which, even though we knew Afghan heroin was always to some degree going to the US, it changed hands so many times, you really had a difficult time proving the knowledge. But this changed that. If we could prove that someone was a drug trafficker in Afghanistan and was providing money to the Taliban, which we knew was happening, we can charge them and prosecute them in the United States. Which brings us to, besides the DEA presence in Afghanistan, we also had a team set up at the DEA Special Operations Division, the Bilateral Investigations Unit, that was tasked with doing extraterritorial cases around the world. And we had a team set up to focus on Afghanistan. If you can go to the next slide, please. So what you'll see on the next slide is some success stories that the US government had targeting high-level kingpin narco-terrorists operating in Afghanistan. And most of them, if not all of them, were operating in Taliban-controlled areas. But we were able to gather evidence proving that they were supporting the Taliban, and not just the Taliban, Al-Qaeda and the Haqqani network. And we were able to get them out of Afghanistan and get them extradited or a judicial expulsion to the US, where they were prosecuted and found guilty of narco-terrorism, and many of them are still in jail facing very long prison sentences. So it just goes to show that we can reach out and we can touch people even in areas where we can't gain access ourselves for safety. So so that brings us to the third part of this presentation. What happens now as of August, when the US and coalition forces pulled out? So initially, right off the bat, we know that our mentoring of the Afghan National Police, we know that the prosecutors that helped on these cases, that judicial wiretap that not only helped put people in jail in Afghanistan, but it gave threat information to protect the Afghans as well as all of us, is now gone, most likely never to return. And let alone the whole separate subject of what happened to those police and prosecutors that worked with us and helped us. I mean, that's clearly one of the things that will never go back. And we all hope and pray that as many people got out as possible that helped all of us. But the other thing is, clearly there was major drug trafficking, heroin and opium production, during the time that the coalition forces were there. But even as recently as like the last couple of weeks, we're getting information that the major kingpins, who we know who they are, and we're constantly trying to build cases against them, are telling people that this is, now that the Taliban's in control, they don't have to put up appearances or hide anymore. They can be out in the open, and it'll make things much easier for them. So that's clearly something that's going to happen moving forward. And finally, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, the Haqqani network, they've been increasingly involved in the drug trafficking, where they used to just maybe profit from taxing the movement of drugs or production. Now they're actually a part of it, more like an organized crime syndicate, where they're involved in the actual drug trafficking, not just making money off of taxes. So they're going to be making much more money, which is going to be helpful to them as most of their money is now frozen. So that's going to be a big part moving forward. So that's just a quick little summary to kind of get us from where we started to where we are now. So Paul, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Larry. Let me ask you a question. In the book that I mentioned earlier, Seeds of Terror, Gretchen Peters said that there was powerful circumstantial evidence that Osama bin Laden profited from opium trafficking. In fact, a spokesman for then British Prime Minister Tony Blair publicly said that UBL was estimated to have a personal supply of 20 to 30 tons, not pounds, tons of opium. Did you see evidence that Al-Qaeda, not just the Taliban, but Al-Qaeda was profiting from drug trafficking? And is that, if so, is that likely to continue, go away, or in fact increase?
The short answer is yes. I mean, having done this for a long period of time, we've spoken to a lot of different people that were operating in Afghanistan during that time. You're talking pre 9/11 to shortly after 9/11, and yeah, we've talked to many people who gave information that Al Qaeda was involved to some degree with the drug trafficking. So yeah, that's true. But to be clear, the Taliban, was always historically more involved with the drug trafficking, just because there are more of them and they're physically there. But yes, we definitely did get information that Al Qaeda was involved to some degree, not in the way that the Taliban was, but they were definitely getting money from the drug trade.
How much of that drug trade, if you know, or even can estimate, winds up in the United States rather than coming from Mexico? We know that heroin comes into the US from Mexico. How much of it from Afghanistan makes its way to the US, and how does that happen?
Well, we could probably do a whole talk on that subject alone. But so clearly, because of the proximity to Mexico and the porous Mexican border, the vast majority of drugs, including heroin, coming into the United States come from Mexico. I don't think anyone doubts that. But I do think there is a dispute among law enforcement about how much Afghan heroin is in fact coming into the United States. So as I said previously, there's this gigantic stockpile of tons and tons of heroin sitting in East Africa. The East African drug traffickers ship it everywhere. But anyone who's worked heroin cases on the East Coast of the United States knows that besides Mexican heroin, you've got African heroin drug trafficking organizations that bring heroin into the United States. Now, we know that Mexican heroin doesn't get shipped to Africa when you have a big porous border with Mexico. So any heroin coming from African DTOs, drug trafficking organizations, into the US is Afghan heroin. Now, another piece to this puzzle is Canada has, for the last 10 years, said that at least 80% of the heroin they seize in Canada comes from Afghanistan, which is the direct opposite from the United States. And all that heroin doesn't stay in Canada, or opium. Just recently, 2 years ago, the Canadians seized a ton of opium in a container from a ship that came out of Pakistan, and it was seized. So as we also know, what we seize is really a small portion of what is actually showing up. So yeah, there's clearly Afghan heroin coming into the United States. How much? That's a whole subject where DEA does signature analysis of our seizures, where we can determine where it comes from. But some of the other government agencies don't do that. If heroin is seized at an airport, for example, from an African carrying like 10 pounds of heroin in a suitcase, they won't necessarily do a signature analysis. So if it came from Afghanistan, we would never know that. And of course, when you're focused on your biggest threat, which is the border with Mexico, you would expect that that's where you're going to seize the most heroin, and you're not really focusing or looking at the border with Canada. So it's kind of a long answer, but the question is, I think everyone that I know who talks about this subject matter believes that there's more heroin coming into the United States than formally the government of the US is acknowledging.
Larry, we left the Afghanistan last month or August. We no longer have boots on the ground there. How much does leaving hurt our ability to learn what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan? I mean, I know the DEA does a great job trying to gather intelligence in all sorts of countries where we don't have the military. But how much of a injury did we suffer when the military left Afghanistan in our ability to learn what's happening and try to interdict it?
Well, I mean, clearly the military's presence made it easier for DEA to operate there. But as far as the intelligence we were getting, it was more, we got our intelligence from our presence in Afghanistan, not necessarily from the military, because as I said, DEA's relationship in that part of the world goes back decades. And there's continuity there that, we're talking to the same people now that we were talking to 20 years ago. And there's a relationship there. But what's gone forever, like I said, not to repeat myself, without the presence of the judicial wiretap, without the presence of dealing with the Afghan police, and they have their own network of sources that we did not have as well. So that's all gone. We can't get that back. But from an optimistic point of view, all of those success stories that I showed you that we have, and those are all great stories in and amongst themselves. There were really bad people that were providing massive quantities of money to the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and the Haqqani network. And a lot of them were true believers in terms of some people paid money to the Taliban because they had to. They didn't like them, but in order to be a drug trafficker, you had to pay money. Others were true believers in the Taliban cause and gave much more money than they were required to give because they believed in what the Taliban was doing. But because of this relationship, like I said, we were able to build cases in Taliban-controlled areas, much like it is now. To a certain degree, those big kingpin targets, I think we have the ability to get them from the outside. But all of the cases and all of the internal prosecutions that were done in conjunction with the Afghan National Police, yeah, that's going to be near impossible to do those kind of cases from the outside.
Pakistan is an ally of the United States on many things, but in this field, it seems like they sometimes are an ally, and according to reports I've read, they're sometimes supporting the drug trafficking. What can you tell us about our ability to rely on Pakistan to assist us in dealing with transnational drug trafficking?
Yeah, as you said, that's a complex question. We have information that a lot of the major drug traffickers in that part of the world, because they're Afghans in most cases, but they would lay their head in Pakistan across the border, where I showed you across from Helmand province and from Kandahar province. If there was ever a threat, they just go across the border, and they knew they were protected by Pakistan. Now, when I say Pakistan intelligence, the ISI protected a lot of the drug traffickers. I mean, that is true. That doesn't mean that ISI itself was supporting the drug traffickers, but elements within ISI were definitely doing that. That was something from the moment that I started working this area, was the connection that there were those within ISI that were either escorting drug shipments through Pakistan to get to the coast, to get put on ships, and they were protected. So yeah, I mean, that's been going on a long time, and it's Iran as well, where their intelligence service was working with the traffickers to escort the drugs through their country to get into Europe as well. So yeah, that's been going on a long time, and I don't think it's just drug trafficking. I'm sure other elements of the U.S. government would also chime in about other ways that Pakistan was helping the Taliban.
You mentioned the drugs going into Europe, and from what I've read, they also go into Russia. Have the European Union and its constituent nations, as well as Russia, been any help in trying to address this problem?
So it's interesting because the Russians, as far as working with the United States, has been almost non-existent in recent years. But the one area where we did come together on some common ground and some investigations was drug trafficking, because with DEA is not a political organization; it's just a police organization, that goes after drug traffickers. And so there was some sharing of information with Russia during this time, but within Europe, so the British were clearly involved. They were in Afghanistan. They were working with the Afghans just like we were, with some judicial wiretap information, and so they put themselves right there on the front line as well. But we did work with the European countries because we had a lot of times the laws that they didn't have. Most European countries don't have conspiracy laws, don't have extraterritorial opportunities to go after those targets. So there's only so much they can do legally. But the police themselves have been very receptive to working with us, and we've passed information to them that led to seizures in their countries as well. So a lot of it is not that they don't want to; it's just that their laws don't allow them to do as much as the U.S. laws. And I'll just throw in some kudos to Australia as well, because they had a big presence in Afghanistan, and they understand the importance of the heroin trade and the drug trade in financing the Taliban and other terrorist networks. So they've been very helpful as well.
What about the Afghan police and army? I know you said that there's a great risk that the people who helped you are now in peril. But when they were helping you, how well equipped and how well motivated were they to help the DEA?
I would say it's like in most developing countries, where you really have to, pick and choose who you're working with. So in Afghanistan, we had a vetted unit that we worked with over there that were polygraphed, on a regular basis. So we had some trust in that unit, that specific unit that we were working with. But just like anywhere, there's good and there's bad police. And when you're not getting paid very much and there's millions of dollars floating around, and it's not just the police, it's the government officials and stuff, even at the highest level of the government. So to say that there was some corruption amongst the Afghan police, yes, but that it was, not just there, it was up and down the whole government, and not just in Afghanistan as well. As like I said, if you're getting paid a little bit of money and you're barely putting food on the table, and people are offering you a lot of money, there is that potential. So yeah, I mean, there was that there, but I think overall the people that we were working with specifically did a good job.
Larry, now that you're retired, have you reflected on what you would have done differently during the time you worked for the DEA about addressing the problems in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, it's complex, but one of the issues is, you have to pick and choose who you're targeting for prosecution in country, and those that would stand no chance of seeing a jail cell in Afghanistan, and choosing to prosecute those people elsewhere, because in Afghanistan it was not possible for those people that I showed you on the screen would never have seen a jail cell. They were connected to the very top levels of government. So that would be, I think, trying to get those people in jail outside the United States getting more of those type of people, because even though they get replaced clearly, just like Pablo Escobar after he died, they replaced him eventually, but it does stop the flow of money to those people that are trying to do us harm, and it may take them another step to replace those kind of people. And if you keep going after them and know that we can get our hands on them, it'll change the way they do business.
Larry, we're getting very short on time. Is there anything you would like to add to what you said, either in terms of what you know, what we need to do, or what you would do if you were king for a day and trying to direct how we deal with this problem?
Well, I would say, yeah, things look bad right now. I mean, clearly after the way the withdrawal went, but it could also be an opportunity if you want to be a positive thinker, because all of those traffickers and the actual Taliban members that are involved in the drug trafficking are probably going to let down their guard, right? There's nothing for them to internally be afraid of anymore, and that could be an opportunity for those in the U.S. government to continue to target these people and take really bad people off the battlefield. So, as a takeaway, I would say, thinking positive, there's an opportunity here if the U.S. continues to keep doing what we've been doing.
Larry, let me thank you very much. I appreciate not just the time you spent preparing for this, as well as presenting what you know, but all the years of service you gave to the people of America, both in the U.S. military and in the Drug Enforcement Administration. You mentioned trying to give kudos to the Australians earlier. I want to give them to you as well. Thank you very much for everything you've done. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us here today.
Thank you.